In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the hardware I'll be using to build out my new HDMI distribution setup, and I'll be using this massive 8x8 HDBaseT Matrix from OREI. If you've seen my previous video where I set up an HDMI distribution system in my old place, I also use a matrix from OREI here, which is a much smaller one. It's a 4x4 matrix and it distributes the signal out over category cables. It's a sort of proprietary HDMI over CAT system with these external receivers, so you can run regular Cat6 cables from this into the receiver and connect remote TVs to this. So OREI saw that video and asked me about what my plans were for the new setup. And off the back of that, they sent me this over to try out. So just for full disclosure, OREI have sent me this system free of charge to try out, but they're not telling me anything to say, and they won't be seeing this video before it goes live, so I'll be giving my honest opinion. But just to be completely upfront, I'm going to say that, and I'll be putting the includes paid promotion thing on this video because they have sent me this to try out. But compared to this, what they've sent me here is a much higher end matrix. It's a lot bigger, it uses the proper HDBaseT protocol, so we'll talk about that in a minute, and has a lot of features, including some that will be really interesting for my new setup. So let's get this out of the box and take a look at what we get, because this kit comes with a lot of stuff for your money. It's a very, very good value for money option. So, yep, let's get this box open, get it all out, get this all unpacked, and see what it's like. So here we have the kit they've sent me, and this is the OREI UHD88-EXB400R-K. And this is their highest end 8x8 HDBaseT Matrix. So let's talk about what those different terms mean. Just try and explain this to everyone who hasn't seen this before. If you've seen my previous video, I've covered this sort of stuff before, so feel free to skip past this if you already know what this all is. But essentially, an HDMI matrix is a type of HDMI switch where you can plug a bunch of different inputs in, a bunch of different displays, and you can route any of the inputs to any of the outputs. So unlike a basic HDMI splitter where you can send one input in and feed out to a bunch of different displays, or an HDMI switch where you can feed a bunch of inputs in and switch between which inputs displayed on the output TV, with this you can plug in up to 8 inputs, up to 8 displays, and route any input to any of those displays. So you could have, say, a games console displaying on one TV, you could then have a set-top box displaying on another TV, or you could have this set-top box displaying across all 8 output TVs. You can switch them around and basically completely assign any input to any output. So that's the matrix side of thing. What about HDBaseT? So HDBaseT is a standard for routing HDMI video over standard category cables, so Cat5, Cat6, Cat6A type cables. Now, I'm being quite careful here when referring to them as category cables, not Ethernet cables or network cables, because HDBaseT isn't a network protocol, and this confuses a lot of people. So it uses standard cables, so you'll plug your network cable, one end will plug into the matrix, the other end will plug into the receiver, and you can send a standard single cable between the two devices. However, HDBaseT isn't a network protocol, so you can't send it through things like network switches, it won't work over a point-to-point wireless bridge, you can't use things like power line adapters to send it over your mains wiring. All of those are Ethernet devices, not just straight category cable. So that's just something to bear in mind with these devices. They just need straight point-to-point links from the matrix to the receivers. You can't send this through any kind of network switching or routing hardware. It's not an issue with the system, that's completely standard, but it's just something to bear in mind. Don't go and buy this and it's expecting it to do one thing when it's not really going to do that. So just important to bear in mind. But yeah, this is an HDBaseT matrix, so what you can do is you can run standard category cables from the matrix to all your TVs, which I've already installed in my house, put these receivers behind each of the TVs, plug the category cable into the HDBaseT input, plug the TV into the HDMI output, and this will take the video from that network, from that category cable, send it over HDMI, and display it on the TV. And these systems are absolutely great, because rather than having to feed massive bulky HDMI cables through a building, which are very awkward to do, you have to kind of only buy pre-made lengths and feed them through, and you're feeding a massive HDMI plug through holes. Instead, what you can do is run a normal Cat6 or Cat5, Cat6A type cable through your building, put normal keystone jacks on the end, and then just plug these devices in. So it makes it very easy to route videos over long distances through a building. In terms of distances, this one here, which is the EXB400R, is rated up to 400 feet or 150 meters. You can see it on the front of the manual there. So that means that with this, you can theoretically send a video over 150 meters of cable, which is a very long distance. They also do another version of this that's slightly cheaper, and it's the EXB230R. That's the exact same thing, but it's only rated up to 230 feet of cable, so about 70 meters, which to be honest, for most setups is probably fine. So this also allows you to send the video much longer distances than you can with regular HDMI cables, which are, especially at 4K, they're going to start to struggle even about the 10 meter mark. And in terms of resolution, this matrix can handle basically anything we're going to throw at it. It's rated up to full 4K HDMI 2.0 spec. It says it can handle all sort of HDR standards, 444 chroma subsampling, standard frame rates. So it'll be interesting to try it out with all the kind of, with HDR and everything and actually put it through its paces. But realistically, this thing should handle any kind of HDMI 2.0 sources you throw at it. It's not going to kind of limit you at all. And then the final spec you might have noticed me talking about is when referring to this, I'm saying this is an HDBaseT Matrix, whereas with this older system, I referred to it as HDMI over CAT. And that's because there is kind of a bit of a difference between these. When it comes to HDBaseT, which is a newer matrix, that's an actual standard that's published by an organisation, and there's a bunch of different devices that use the HDBaseT standard. Technically, that does allow some interoperability. You can kind of mix and match matrices and receivers and things like that. You can sometimes end up with proprietary technologies on some of them that maybe don't make them quite work together, but the idea is it is a standard. And with HDBaseT devices, they operate at very high data rates. So I'm not 100% sure which version of the HDBaseT standard this uses, but assuming it's HDBaseT 1.0 or 2.0, that means this operates at a data rate of around about 8 gigabits a second over the category cable, which is a very high speed data rate that means it can transmit HDMI data at very high quality. Now, when you're talking about things like HDMI 2.0, that definitely runs at a higher data rate than about 8 gigabit. For example, as you can see here, this says 18 gigabit because that's referring to HDMI 2.0, which operates at around about 18 gigabits a second. So there will still be some compression to get that 18 gigabit stream over an 8 gigabit HDBaseT channel. However, that compression isn't too high, and it's usually described by vendors of this kind of kit as visually lossless. Realistically, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference. It's just a very, very light compression that's applied. And it's also a very sort of low latency compression that's applied. These devices don't really have any kind of data buffer that's used to handle that compression, so the data is sent through with basically no latency at all. It's just a very light compression that you shouldn't really notice. If on the other hand you want even better quality with less compression, you can look at HDBaseT 3.0, which OREI don't currently do in a matrix. It's quite rare to get in a matrix just because it's so new, but they do some standalone transmitter and receiver pairs that operate on the HDBaseT 3.0 standard that can go up to 16 gigabits a second, which basically allows completely uncompressed HDMI 2.0. But realistically, even if this operates at HDBaseT 1.0 or 2.0, the quality will be absolutely brilliant. You will not notice the compression. On the other hand, these lower end HDMI over CAT devices, they're a lot less expensive because they don't use the same standard as HDBaseT devices, but these generally operate at slightly lower data rates. It's also usually not published because they're not operating on a real standard. It's kind of just a proprietary set of transmitter and receiver chips, but these are going to operate at lower data rates and therefore have slightly higher compression and therefore slightly worse video quality than these higher end HDBaseT matrices. The HDMI over CAT systems are still great and they're definitely a good cost-effective option, but if you're in a situation where the video quality is more important than keeping the cost down, you definitely want to be looking at an HDBaseT Matrix. So now that I've explained what we're looking at, let's take a look at what you get in the box. So here we have the main kit that comes with it. So you get the Matrix itself, which is a nice 2U device. So it is a rack mountable device and it comes with rack ears separately, so you can rack mount it if you want, which is what I'll be doing. But if you don't want to use the rack ears, it actually comes with pre-attached rubber feet, which is nice, so you can stand on a table without having to worry about the metal scratching. And then if you want to rack mount, you can take those feet off and mount the rack ears to rack mount it. You also get the 8 HDBaseT receivers included, which makes this a really good value option because this kit costs around about £2,000, just under £2,000, which seems like a lot of money. But with a lot of vendors of this type of kit, you have to buy the Matrix individually, which in itself can cost a good few £1,000s, and then you're paying well over £100 quite often for each of the receivers. Whereas for under £2,000 with this, you get the entire Matrix and 8 of the receivers, so that makes it a very good value option. So you've got the receivers here, they're nice little metal devices with all the ports on the back. We'll take a look at all the ports in a minute and explain how that all works. And then also included in the box, you get a few accessories we'll quickly go through. So you get the rack ears to mount the Matrix itself. You get a manual, which is a manual, you can read it if you want. A couple little cards, one about the warranty. And then in the box, you also get this little card here that says, this extender supports power over Ethernet cable and therefore and thus requires only one power adapter. So what this is referring to is the fact that the receivers have a DC jack on them, but you don't need to use that. So the Matrix itself you provide mains power to, and all the receivers are powered over the cable, over the Cat6 or Cat6A type cable you're feeding to this. They don't need a power adapter plugged into this port here. Now, the reason they'll have this port is because rather than buying a Matrix like this, you can just buy transmitter and receiver pairs where you essentially have two devices like this. One's a transmitter and one's a receiver. With those, you would also need to plug a power adapter into them, but only on one end. So you could either plug the power adapter into the transmitter end or the receiver end, and whatever end has the power will feed down to the other one. But with a Matrix like this, because you've got the big Matrix, you don't need to plug anything into that adapter. So that card's basically just saying, don't get this and freak out that you didn't get 8 power adapters for these, you don't need them. You then get some IR blasters and receivers, so these can connect into the individual matrix receivers and the matrix itself. So you get a bunch of these, enough basically for, I think probably get about 8 of each, so enough for all your TVs. And what you get is IR blasters, which can emit infrared signals, and infrared receivers that can receive infrared signals from your remotes. And with these, you can either plug them into the individual receivers themselves or plug them into the matrix. And this would allow you to transmit infrared signals from remote controls around your system. So for example, you can have an infrared receiver connected to each TV and connected into the matrix receiver. And then at the matrix switch end, you can plug the IR blasters in. And if you have all your set-top boxes and stuff connected into this matrix, when you press the infrared button in one of the rooms, it's received by the receiver, sent down the HDBaseT cable into the matrix, and then the matrix blasts it out over this infrared LED to let you control the remote devices. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to control this setup yet. In this video, we'll just get it working and then I'll go away and try and figure out all the control mechanisms. I may end up using these, or I may end up building something a bit more custom. And as I mentioned, you don't just get 2 of these, you get enough for all these. You get about 8 of each, I think maybe just a little bit more than 8 of each. Next up, for sort of control and configuration, you get a DB9 serial cable. And then what's also really nice is it actually includes a DB9 to USB adapter, so actually a serial to USB adapter, which are genuinely useful things to have anyway, so it's nice to actually get one in the box. So this allows you to connect this up to a device over USB to access a serial console. Now, this is a network device, this is fully controllable over the network, and we'll take a look at that. But if instead you want to control it locally just over a serial console, or set the network up through a serial console, integrate with various smart home controllers that can use a serial interface, it's nice to get all that in the box. Final accessories that aren't very exciting is you get some mounting brackets for the receivers, so you can mount it onto the receiver and kind of screw a receiver to a wall or something like that. You get a bunch of Phoenix connectors which you'd use for the serial and the audio connections on this. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And you get a remote control which you can use to control the matrix. Now, in a larger environment like I have here where it's controlling TVs throughout the house, I'll need to build a fairly custom integration to control all this. So I'll probably end up using Home Assistant and either build some sort of smartphone dashboard that can control it, or potentially have remote controls or touchscreens in various rooms. That's all going to come in future videos. But if on the other hand you're say installing this in like a bar or a hospitality setting where this is in a central area where you're going to control it from, and you've got TVs around the building, you can very easily use this remote at the matrix itself or the buttons on the front to switch the inputs around. So it really depends. You can either control it locally if you're standing in front of the matrix, or if you've got the matrix in a remote room, you might need to integrate it with some sort of smart home system, or just take this remote room to room and use the IR blaster if you really wanted to do that. So now here we have the matrix itself. So on the front you can see we've got a little LCD type screen there, IR receiver and various buttons. So if you want, you can control it from this. Essentially you're going to be doing something like pressing the output there and the input there. So say you want to display input 3 on output 2, you can just kind of press output 2, input 3 or similar and control it through that. There's also various options to get through the menus. There's a little menu system on this, so you can control it locally with the matrix if you want. Of course, I'll be using the network control for it all. And then if you take a look around the back of it all, we can see all the ports. And as you can see, this thing has an absolute ton of connectivity. So what I'll do is I'll run through all the connectivity on this and try and explain how it all works. So simplest connectivity first, you've got a power connection there, so standard IEC connection, nice having a built-in power supply, power switch for that so you can connect it to the mains. Then for network connectivity, you've either got your RS-232 serial port or an Ethernet port to connect to the network. Then when it comes to HDMI inputs, that's very simple. You've got 8 HDMI ports here you can connect all your devices to. So you can feed a bunch of sources into this device to distribute throughout your house. Then for all the outputs, you have a bunch of different outputs here. So 8 of them, and each output has an HDBaseT output and a regular HDMI output. So if you're using this as an HDBaseT Matrix, which is what I'll be doing, what I'll do is I'll run a Cat6 cable, or a Cat6A cable in my case, from each of these ports to behind the TV, and then behind that TV, the other end of that cable will connect into the receiver, and the TV will connect into this over HDMI. So of course you'll be doing this at a much larger scale across a building, but essentially you'll have a cable going from an output there into the input on the receiver, like that, and then the HDMI port on the receiver will connect to a TV. You're not going to have any kind of network switches in the way, no power line adapters, no Wi-Fi bridges. You need a straight network cable, Cat6 cable, from the matrix into the receiver. Now, you can put passive devices in there. There's no problem, for example, running this cable through a patch panel or through a wall face plate or anything like that, using various patch cables to extend the cable to where it needs to get to. That's all completely fine. You just can't have any sort of active networking equipment on that link. So that's how all the outputs work there. And it is really nice having a mix of HDBaseT outputs and regular HDMI ports, because there may be situations, for example, that you actually have a display local to this, so you've already got a couple of HDMI cables that come into this directly, where you don't want to necessarily have to use HDBaseT. With this, you can actually use these regular HDMI outputs as well. So it's nice to have that mix of connectivity. The The next ports we have are over here, which are IR ports. And you can see you've got 8 IR inputs and 8 IR outputs, and then a couple of all outputs and inputs as well. And this is used for distributing infrared signals. And then the final outputs that completely sold me on this matrix is these audio outputs. So if we look closer in at these are going to be absolutely brilliant for my multi-room audio setup. So with these you get 8 different audio outputs, and each of these has either a coax digital output or Phoenix connectors for a balanced analog audio output. So that's what these Phoenix connectors that came in the box are. They're a kind of standardized type of connector, so what you do is you have these connectors here, they plug into the back of the device there, and you can just use these screw terminals to attach bare wires in. And what this lets you do is extract audio from all the sources that are connected into this and route that analog audio or digital audio out of these connectors. Now, there is some limitations on what type of codecs you can send out of this. For example, if you're trying to send Atmos audio through this matrix, you won't be able to extract that Atmos audio on this, and I think you can extract some Dolby Digital things over the coax, but if you want to get the audio out of the analog output, you have to just send regular stereo audio through this. But this is going to be absolutely perfect for my setup here, because as part of this, I'm also going to be installing a massive multi-room audio system. So next to this matrix in the rack, I'll also have an audio matrix, so all of the audio will be routed out of this into the audio matrix, and then that audio matrix can take all those audio signals and route them through to ceiling speakers in different rooms throughout the house. So what that means is I could say have a Chromecast or a set-top box plugged into this, I can then route the audio from that device to one of these outputs, that can then feed into the audio matrix, and that way I could say play music on Spotify through the Chromecast, route it to one of these outputs, feed it into the matrix, and send it to ceiling speakers throughout the house. So having this audio extraction capability is going to be super useful, and I'm really excited to try it out. It's also nice as well, this is balanced audio. Now, you don't have to use it balanced, you could just connect 3 of the wires up and just use it unbalanced. But having balanced audio is going to be really, really good, because in my case, the matrix or DSP I'm using does actually accept balanced input, so that'll be good for interference reduction. And a lot of commercial AV systems will use balanced audio, so it's really quite nice to see that. It's definitely quite a high-end device in terms of this audio connectivity. So finally, when it comes to all the ports, let's talk very quickly about how they're assignable and which ports are assignable and which ones aren't, and how all that kind of works. Now, this is all detailed in the manual in quite a lot of detail, and it does explain it quite clearly, which is good. So it's definitely worth checking this just to make sure you understand which ports are mapped and how you can assign them and switch them all around, just to make sure it's definitely going to do what you need. So with this, you've got your 8 inputs and your 8 outputs. And you can matrix switch any of these 8 inputs to any of the outputs. You can have them all mirrored, you can have any combination and any number of ports active at once. Within each output, you've got both an HDMI port and an HDBaseT port, and these are mirrored, so these 2 ports are mirrored, these 2 ports are mirrored, and so on. The most you can do with these is you can switch them on and off independently, but they will be mirroring each other. But that's basically what you'd expect. It's an 8x8 matrix, you've got 8 inputs and 8 outputs. Next up, we have the audio outputs, where you have 8 different outputs, and each output has a coax output for digital audio and a balanced audio analog output for analog audio. So you have 8 of these, and then each of these is basically mapped one-to-one with one of the video outputs. So you can't really matrix assign these independently of the video. Whatever video source you have outputting through output 1, the audio of that will come out through audio output 1. If you then say got another source playing out of video output 5, the audio from that will come out of audio output 5. That's completely fine, but it's just something to be aware of because some matrices do allow you to independently matrix assign the audio separately from the video, but with this it just mirrors the video outputs, which will be fine for my setup. Because of my setup here I have 6 TVs, essentially I'll be using 6 of the HDMI outputs, which will mean I'll have 2 outputs completely unused, and I'll use those for situations where I want to send analog audio out of the matrix into the audio distribution system when I'm not necessarily displaying that source on a TV. So if I want to say play Spotify on a Chromecast and stream that music through to a bathroom, I'll still have 2 analog audio outputs available that I can use for that purpose. So that's completely fine, but just something to bear in mind. Finally, we have all the infrared ports, which I'll try and explain, but again, it is all detailed in the manual, so if my rambling doesn't make much sense, the manual definitely explains it better. And I'll hold the page there so you can pause the video and read that, because it probably makes a lot more sense than my rambling is going to be. But with this, you've got the IR inputs and the IR outputs. So the IR inputs you can connect an IR receiver to, and it'll pass the IR signals from that receiver through to the receiver at the remote TV, and then this receiver will send out the IR output to an IR blaster. These are mapped one-to-one with the outputs, so any IR codes sent into input 1 here will come out of output 1 to the receiver. Anything sent into input 8, for example, will always come out of output 8 to its connected receiver, and any IR codes sent into all will come out of all your connected HDBaseT receivers. These don't map, they don't switch, they are always mapped one-to-one. On the other hand, you have the IR outputs on the matrix and then the IR inputs on the receivers, and these work in the opposite direction. So you'd have an IR receiver at your remote TVs, IR blasters at the matrix, and any IR command sent in the remote location will be sent down the cable and come out of the IR ports here. And these ports are switchable, and they follow whichever input devices are displayed on that relevant output. So for example, if you've got output 1 displaying input 8, and you're then in the output 1 location and you send a remote control code that comes down, it'll come down here, and because the output 1 is displaying input number 8, the IR codes will come out of IR out 8. Likewise, if you've got output 4 displaying input 5, and you press command in that remote room, that command will come out of IR out 5. These numbers here map to whatever input device is picked, not the output device. And that's generally what you'd want, because if you want to stick an IR emitter onto each device, so you say you've got a set-top box, you want to stick an IR emitter directly to the front of that box, it's good to have that IR emitter displaying, sending the codes out for the zones that have that source being displayed. It means you can have several set-top boxes close together and directly route the IR commands directly into the relevant device rather than kind of just blasting it into the room and hoping the right device picks it up. So just like to bear in mind that the audio outputs and the IR outputs aren't assignable in software. You can't matrix switch these independently and control them through the API, but they are kind of mapped one-to-one to various different things, and it's just important to understand that mapping. Generally, it makes a lot of sense and it'll work absolutely fine for most setups. This is very sane defaults, the way they've kind of got this set up. It's just worth familiarising yourself with the manual just to make sure you are very aware of how all this works, just so it's going to work for your settings. And of course, you can download the manual from the OREI website so you can easily check it out and check how it's all going to work before you buy it. You don't have to kind of buy it and then hope it works for you. You can easily see how all this sort of mapping and assigning all works. The final thing on this device is you have a couple of fans on one of the sides. They're not super loud, but equally it's not the sort of thing you probably want to have sitting next to your head all day. But they're not terrible, they're generally pretty quiet. And what's really nice to see here is these are actually Sunon maglev fans. It's probably a bit nerdy, me nerding out over the exact type of fan, but those are really good high quality fans. They're definitely not cheaped out on nasty off-brand fans. These are the types of fans that I've actually used in the past when I'm trying to fit quieter fans into things like network switches. They're very good quality, and for the amount of airflow they get, they're not too loud, which is good. So that's Matrix out the way. Now let's take a look at one of the receivers. So receivers are quite neat, they're nice little metal devices, and of course you do have the ability to put mounting hardware on the bottom and mount them if you wanted. On the front, you've not really got much at all, just an LED and a serverish USB port, which you shouldn't really need to use. That'll be for things like firmware updates. And then round the back, you have all the connectivity. So we have the DC in jack that we saw before that you won't need because all power will be provided by the Matrix over the CAT cable. You have the HDBaseT input, so that's what you'll connect into the network, the CAT cable that runs from here through to the Matrix. HDMI out is what will connect to your TV. You then have an analog audio output, so a stereo audio output that you can then connect to some sort of audio source. Now again, this will be like the Matrix. I imagine this will only work when you're sending 2-channel audio through this, so just stereo audio. I imagine if you send any kind of surround sound or Atmos audio through this, this audio output won't work. But for a lot of settings, this could be really useful just to get analog audio out of the Matrix. You then have an IR input and an IR output, so depending on what you want to do with infrared, if you either want an IR emitter at your remote TVs or an IR receiver at your remote TVs, you can do that. For example, you could maybe want an IR emitter at all your remote TVs so that you can turn them off from a central location or control them from a central location, or you might want the IR receiver at each remote TV so you can send remote control commands from all your TVs back to the devices at the Matrix. It's good to have both these options for flexibility. The final port you have here is a serial port essentially, so it's RS-232, transmit and receive. And like the audio ports, it's a Phoenix connector, so you get a bunch of smaller Phoenix connectors in the box, like that. You could use this to connect up to some sort of serial control system. So I'm not going to be using that in this system here, but if you wanted to send some sort of serial commands from your remote TVs to your Matrix centrally, you could use that. So generally it's going to be used for much higher end control systems, the likes of Control 4, Crestron, those kind of really high end, sort of tightly integrated smart home control systems. You might need to use some sort of serial control and send serial between the devices, so that's what that is there. Not something I'll be using here, but it's nice to have that option if you need it. So now that we've taken a look at the hardware, let's talk about how I'm going to be using this in my setup. So in this house we have a bunch of TVs throughout the place. To be honest, a bit of a ridiculous number of TVs for a house with 2 people in it. We've got a TV in the living room, the kitchen, the master bedroom, my partner's office, my office, and the guest bedroom. So there's quite a lot of TVs going around. And what I want with this is to have the Matrix in my comms rack with a few input devices connected to it. I'm still deciding which devices I'll put in the rack connected to this and which I'll leave connected to the living room TV, but at the very least I'm going to have a couple of Chromecasts connected to this, probably an Apple TV, potentially some sort of device displaying a smart home dashboard, potentially my CCTV NVR feeding the cameras so I can display them on various TVs. I might move my Sky set-top box into this, and I might even look into routing the video from a PS5 in the living room into this Matrix so it can then be distributed to other rooms. And then if I do the PS5 thing, there'll probably be a whole bunch of stuff there about trying to get the control signals from the controller sent across some sort of network interface back to the console, but that'll be a future video. But essentially what I want is to have a few sources centrally in the rack that can then be distributed to TVs throughout the house. What that means is if, for example, I want to watch things in multiple rooms, say for example my partner's watching something in the living room and I want to watch the same thing in the kitchen while cooking, I can put the same thing on both TVs at the same time in complete sync. Or if it's a situation where I'm doing my usual thing of running around like a headless chicken, doing a bunch of projects in the house, running between rooms, but I want to follow something that I'm watching, I can display it on all the TVs. And then with this as well, because I'll be connecting this into my audio distribution setup, it means that the audio from anything that's being watched on this can also be sent to ceiling speakers in various rooms. So for example, I could have something playing in the living room, but I could stream the audio from that to all the other rooms in the house so I can follow what I'm doing as I'm walking around, or I could use it to say stream background music. And then even for rooms that don't have TVs at all, the plan would still be to use this as the main audio source for the multi-room audio system. So say for example I want to play music in the shower, what I would do is I would stream that music to the Chromecast that's connected to this, the audio output of this would then send into the audio matrix, and that would then send it to the amplifiers and send it through to the bathroom. So essentially the idea of this is to have a device that's connected to a bunch of different options for inputs that I can cast various sources to, and then this device can send them throughout the house to anywhere I could possibly want to consume that media. So let's look at the hardware. Now let's get this quickly fired up on the bench here, just to take a look at the control system and the web interface, and then what we'll do is we'll get it installed in the rack and get it all fired up. Okay, so I've now gone away for a while, played about with the Matrix, and figured out all the different ways of controlling it, both through the interface itself and over the network through a web interface and the API, and figured out my integration with Home Assistant I'm going to be doing. So what we'll do is we'll quickly take a look at all the different ways of interfacing with this device. I'll then go away, get it racked up, get a prototype of my initial setup all working, and then we'll go back and take a look at the actual final setup. But yeah, in terms of control, you've got a few different options. Of course, there's a little control panel on the device itself, so you can kind of wake up just by pressing a button. You've got a little screen here, so you can cycle through a few different menu options on there. It does have a very loud, annoying beep. You can turn that off in the web interface and disable it. I've left it enabled for now just while I'm doing all the initial integration because it's quite useful if I'm in another room to hear this beeping to know that my configuration is being changed, but long term I'll probably turn that setting off. But from here you can fairly easily switch your input. So right now it says output 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, input 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And each vertical column of numbers is a mapping between an input and an output. So if I want to say change output 1 to input 3, for example, all you would do is press output 1 will start flashing, press input 3, and as you can see, it now says 1 and 3, so it's now switched, so output 1 will be showing input 3. It's fairly easy to do that from the device. You've got 8 buttons, so it's dead easy just to you can figure exactly what to do, so output 8, input 5, there you go, it's done. Very, very easy. Similarly, you've got the remote control that works basically the same. Only thing to bear in mind is it's kind of inverted from that, so the inputs are on the top, outputs are on the bottom, and you have to press the output first, so you've kind of got to go bottom and then top, but once you get your head around that, again, very easy to do. It's the sort of control system you see on so many HDMI matrices. It's a very easy way of doing it. And for a lot of people that'll work fine if you're using this in say a bar or a hospitality setting where this is sitting behind the bar and staff are just going to go up and just press buttons on the remote or on the control panel to control it. That's probably all you're going to need. But of course in a smart home setting, you're not going to be going out to the garage or the comms rack and pressing these buttons or pointing this little remote at the Matrix or IR blasters. You're going to want to control it over the network. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so the first way you can control this Matrix is through the web interface. So it's a fairly simple web interface here. It's very similar to my old HDMI Matrix from OREI, and also it's the same interface I've seen across a lot of different HDMI matrices, so I think they all run very similar software. But it's a fairly nice web interface, so you can log in here, you can set a username and password on it. In here, you can then go into the video section, where this is where you'll assign all your inputs and outputs. So you can see here we have all the outputs down here, all the inputs here, and all you'll do is just, for each output, you can pick which input you want to display on it. You can also set some presets where you can kind of name them and sort of pick particular combinations of inputs and outputs and then save it as a preset and then recall that preset. So again, that could be particularly useful in say a hospitality setting where you've maybe got one preset for a live sports event where you'll put certain devices on certain screens, another preset for a sort of normal night where all the screens might show advertising. You could use that, that could be quite useful. As you can see here, some of these are named. You can name the inputs under the inputs and output section. So in the input section here, you can just simply click into these and set names. And then likewise in the output section, you can also name them. These names aren't really used over the API or anything, but they just make the web interface a little bit easier to manage because you can see the names. Now what we'll do is we'll start off with the input section and explain how all this works, because each section has some things that kind of describe how the functionality of this works and a few different settings you might want to configure. So in the input section, as you can see, you've got your 8 HDMI inputs. The active thing will show if there's a source active, so right now there's no sources connected, so none of these will show, but if there was a source connected, one of these would turn green and indicate that that source is passing video into the matrix. And then as I mentioned, you can name them here, and then over here you can then set the EDID. And this is quite important. So for people who don't know what EDID is, essentially it's the type of information that a display can send to a device that explains what types of resolutions and various audio standards that display is capable of. So if you've got a 4K TV, it'll tell the connected device that it's a 4K display, it supports maybe Dolby surround audio, it maybe supports certain HDR standards, and then your connected device can look at that EDID information and decide what sort of resolution video signal it's going to output. Now with a matrix, that can get a little bit confusing, because you're going to have a lot of different TVs and displays connected to the matrix, and potentially have the same source displayed on a bunch of different displays that all might have different capabilities. So this is something you do need to really carefully manage if you're using an HDMI matrix, because if you've, say, for example, got a 1080p TV and then a 4K TV and then maybe another 4K TV that supports surround sound, another one that supports HDR, if you then try and say output a 4K HDR with surround sound signal to all your TVs, the 1080p TV might not be able to display the resolution, one of the TVs might not be able to do the surround sound Dolby audio, so you won't get sound out of that one. You've got to be very careful to pick an EDID that all your displays that are showing that device are capable of handling. So with this device, you get a bunch of EDID options pre-configured, so they're all defaulted as standards, 1080p stereo audio. Of course, this thing can easily handle 4K, so you can go down here, there's various options for 4K 30, 4K 60, 444 chroma subsampling, 4K 60, so all the HDR standards are in there. Various standards of audio, so you've got Dolby, regular stereo audio, HD audio, some of these have HDR, some of these don't. So these are some pre-configured EDIDs you can pick. You can also select to copy the EDID from an HDMI output and from an HDBaseT output. So if instead of setting a pre-configured EDID on an input on a device, you might instead want to say you want to copy the EDID from a connected display and pass that through to the connected device, that's also an option here. And this is the sort of thing that if you were using this copy sit functionality, you potentially want to use this over the API, where when you switch a source to a display on a particular TV, that you then pick that copy EDID and pass that particular display's EDID through to the connected device. So this is something you would need to kind of either set statically here and then change if you ever need to, or something you're going to want to automate over the API. But all this is completely configurable over the API. You also have the option to export an EDID and re-import it, which is really nice. So you can say you want to pick an EDID from a particular device that's connected, you can then download it. There's EDID editing software you can use to customize all that, and then you can re-upload it to the device as one of these user-defined EDIDs and then pick those. So it's kind of up to you how you handle this. You can either use the copy functionality to try and pick the best EDID for a device based on what displays it's showing on and then pass that through, or you can kind of just pick a safe EDID that you know that all your displays are going to be capable of. And it's really just a bit of a trade-off. If you're happy to sort of copy the EDID and change what EDID is presented based on what displays are showing a source, that'll probably be the way to get you the best quality signal through. Because if you're displaying it only on one TV that supports 4K and HDR and all those standards, then you can pass that through. But the downside is that then if you start switching that around and changing the EDID on the fly based on what displays are showing it, TVs that are already showing that source will cut out for a couple of seconds while the EDID changes and all the video reconfigures. The other option you can do is just pick a very safe EDID that's kind of the best standard possible that all the connected displays you have can cope with. So for example, if some of your TVs can support Dolby audio, others can only support stereo, then you'd want to pick an EDID that only outputs stereo to prevent the TVs that don't support Dolby not being able to output sound. Now, I'm not quite sure what I'll do with my setup here. I think what I'm going to do is pick a fairly safe EDID that all my TVs can support. In particular, I'll be picking ones that use stereo audio, because that then means that the analog audio outputs on the matrix will be able to output the audio. And then any device I have connected to the matrix will be devices that are dedicated for multi-room distribution. So a couple of Chromecasts, maybe an Apple TV, stuff like that. So the devices connected to this matrix will be dedicated to really situations where I want to display the same thing in multiple rooms. And then for a situation that, say, I want to watch a movie in the living room at full HDR 4K with Dolby Atmos and all that kind of stuff, Rather than running that through the Matrix, I'll instead have it either use a smart TV app itself or some sort of local streaming device connected to the living room TV and just play the media back locally there. So this device is more going to be for multi-room stuff. I'm not going to put absolutely all my HDMI sources through it. But yeah, EDID management is something you do kind of need to think about with these sorts of things. But it's good you have an absolute ton of options here. You can configure them through the API or through the web interface. And it's nice that you can sort of copy from it outputs, or you can upload custom EDIDs if you want to. So that's the input section there. Next up we have the output section. And in here you've got all your outputs, and each output is separately has an HDMI and HDBaseT output. Now, with these, of course, you've only got 8 outputs, and then the HDMI and HDBaseT for each output will mirror each other, but it means you can name them separately, and when you've got these options here to switch the stream on and off, so you can toggle the outputs separately. So you could have the HDMI port outputting on a particular one of these outputs and disable the HDBaseT or vice versa. Then in here you can name them all, which is very, very simple. And then the final option here is something that's really useful that this matrix has, is a scaler. So when I talked before about how you can pick an EDID and you need to pick kind of the lowest common denominator for all your TVs, the great thing with this is it does have a built-in 4K to 1080p scaler. So on any particular output, you can either pick bypass, which means it won't scale, also which is where it will try and detect the resolution of your connected TV, and if it's lower than 4K, it will downscale to 1080p. Or you can specifically pick 4K to 1080p, and that output will always be scaled down to 1080p. So that's going to be great for my setup here, and as you can see for the output for bedroom 4, that's set to 4K to 1080p scaling. That's because the TV I have in my guest bedroom, it's an old 1080p TV. It never really gets used much, so there's no point putting a nice new 4K TV in there. Without a scaler, that would mean I would need to set all my devices feeding into the matrix to 1080p so that 1080p TV can display them. But because we have the built-in scaler and I've enabled it on that output, it means that I can pick an EDID that is 4K. I can then send 4K video to all the TVs in the house and they'll all display that 4K signal. And then for the one 1080p TV I have, it can then downscale that to 1080p and that TV will happily display it. This could also be useful for situations, say, where you've maybe got a projector, because a lot of projectors aren't 4K, you can very easily downscale. Now the only thing to bear in mind here is HDR won't be converted, so it's not going to sort of do any tone mapping. So if, for example, you fed a 4K HDR source into this, it would downscale it to 1080p, but the TV, because this TV doesn't support HDR, it would look a bit washed out. It would likely still be watchable, but you'd kind of have that slightly washed out HDR look. But it is really good to have that built-in scaler, so I'll be really interested to try that out and see if it works. Next up, you've got a CEC section, and this will be really interesting to try out to see how well this works. What this allows you to do is send HDMI CEC commands to connected devices. And that works for both input devices and output devices. Now, of course, CEC as a technology is notoriously flaky for being very fussy about things, but in theory what this would allow you to do is to any of your connected input devices, you'd be able to send basic remote control commands, power them on and off and all that kind of stuff. And likewise for your output devices or your connected TVs and displays, you'd be able to turn them on and off, adjust the volume, and switch the device to the input that the matrix is connected to. So if you've got the matrix feeding into an HDMI input on a TV, in theory, if everything works, you'd be able to pick, say, your TV there, press the input button, and that TV on that output would switch directly to the appropriate HDMI output. And these are also controllable over the API. So this could be really useful for doing sort of basic automation of devices that don't have their own network API potentially. If you've not got a TV that can be integrated into the network, or you've got a smart box that isn't really playing nicely with remote control commands, you could potentially use this to control connected devices. And it'll be really interesting to try this out and see how well it works in practice. Finally, you've got a couple other basic options, nothing that exciting. You've got network control here, where you can just set the IP address, static or dynamic, change the password, all that kind of stuff. And then system here is just options for panel lock, which lets you turn off the control on the front panel. So if you don't want people messing about and pressing buttons, you can enable the panel lock. Although I think you can still potentially disable that from the button on the front, I'm not sure. But you can sort of make it a bit tamper-proof. You can turn that annoying beep off, which is very useful because it is very loud. You can change this timeout on the LCD display. You can set the baud rate on the serial port, so if you are using serial port, you might need to change that. And then there's options here for firmware updates if you want to do that. But yeah, that's to the web interface. It's actually a pretty nice interface. It's pretty quick, pretty slick to work with. I've used much more expensive matrices than this that have had a much slower, clunkier web interface, so this is pretty good. But of course, chances are you're not going to use this interface as a primary means of controlling this matrix. You're going to integrate it into some other smart home system, the likes of Control 4, Crestron, or in my case, Home Assistant. So if you have a much higher end smart home and you're using something like Control 4, OREI do provide a Control 4 driver for this, so this should be compatible with Control 4, but because I'm using Home Assistant, I'm going to need to make more of a custom integration. And to do that, I'll be using the Telnet API. So they provide this Excel spreadsheet on their website with the details of the Telnet API, so you can kind of go through this and see all the rough commands. So it's all fairly simple here. For example, if you go through here, there's various options for querying different things. That's all for more settings on the device. But if we come further down, we see we have the commands for controlling the inputs and the outputs. So for example, if you want to set input 1 to display output 2, you'd open up a Telnet session to the device and you'd send SIN1 AV out 2 exclamation mark. So that's input 1, output 2. Likewise, if you wanted input 3 on output 5, you'd send SIN3 AV out 5 exclamation mark. So to very quickly test this live, I've opened up a Telnet session through PuTTY, so we can issue some of these commands. So for example, one of the commands here will let us query which input device is being displayed on a particular output. So I can say RAV out, put in the particular output that I want to check. So I can say 5, like that, and then we can press exclamation mark there, enter, and that's going to say that input 5 is mapped to output 5. And of course, if we change that, that would then be different. We can also switch them around and switch the input, so we can say SIN, and if I want to say switch, like the example here, switch input 1 to be displayed on output 2, I'd say in1 AV out 2 exclamation mark. You'll have heard the beep there from the matrix switching, and now it's updated. So that's the API there. There's an absolute ton of stuff you can do through this. You can switch the HDMI streams on and off. You can adjust the scaler, so you can turn the scalers on and off, or you can get the scaler status. You can set the EDID, which could be very useful if you want to do kind of smart EDID management based on what TVs are showing particular sources. You might want to switch the EDIDs around. That's completely possible to build. And then when it comes to all the CEC stuff we looked at, you've got the option to issue a bunch of CEC commands to all the connected devices through this. So you can hopefully use this to automate various devices you have connected over CEC, which could be really useful. There's other options here for setting up the network device and all that kind of stuff. You can also do that through the web interface. But what you can see here is this is a very simple Telnet API. So obviously, if you've not got any experience building this sort of stuff at all, this might be a bit complicated. But if you've got really any basic programming experience and networking experience, you could very easily automate this either through a custom script or build custom integrations through the likes of Home Assistant and Node-RED. It's not too complicated to automate this. You know, there's no encryption, there's no needing to worry about authentication and various complicated ways of actually trying to connect to this. You literally just need to throw this text at the port and it will work. So it's very, very simple to automate, which is great. And of course that's over Telnet, but there's nothing stopping you doing it over a serial port as well. If you want to control it over the serial port on the back of the device, it's the exact same protocol, both over serial and over Telnet. So it's really good to have such a simple, easy to work with API, and it gives basically full control over this device. So that was a look at the various ways of controlling this device. What I'll now do is I'll go away, get this thing installed in the rack, and then start working on my prototype of my initial Home Assistant integration, where I should then be able to control this from my Home Assistant dashboards. So what I'll do is I'll go away, get this installed, get it all connected up, build a prototype, and we'll come back and take a look at the initial setup that I come up with, and we'll hopefully have this working to display sources on TVs around the house. Okay, so the final thing I want to take a look at before we actually get this in the rack is the power consumption. So right now, the Matrix is powered up, but there's no receivers connected to it, but it's fully powered on and connected to the network. And in that state, we're drawing around 42 watts. So not absolutely zero power consumption, but equally it's not absolutely dreadful. This is kind of par for the course for a large HDMI matrix. And to be honest, I've got another HDMI matrix about the same size as this. It's another 8x8 matrix, and it draws closer to 60 watts, so 42 watts is pretty reasonable. Now, of course, this is with no receivers connected. If we connect the HDBaseT receivers, of course, these themselves will draw some power, so this will put the power consumption up slightly. So if we plug one receiver in there and let that start up, you can see power consumption jumps up to, what, 47.3 watts with one receiver connected. If we plug another receiver in alongside that, it is then going to go up by another couple of watts, so now it's drawing about 51 watts. So I'll let you do the math there and work out how much power it'll use depending on how many receivers you're going to connect. But yeah, that's the sort of power consumption we're looking at there. Now, of course, right now there's no video going through this. It may change as video is sent through it, I don't really know, but that's kind of the power consumption we're going to be looking at. And now let's take a look at standby consumption. So we'll turn it off using the remote here. So we turn that off, I'll put it in standby mode. Power consumption drops down and it sits round about 8 watts. 8.4 watts we're sitting at there. So that's with the matrix completely powered down, all the receivers powered down, but it's still got an active network connection connected. So that means that even though I turned it off through the remote here, you can also sleep it and wake it over the network as well. So that sort of power consumption is not deadly, it's not zero, but it's not absolutely dreadful. And what's also nice is in standby, it turns off the fans completely and completely shuts off. And all it sits with is the network connection active. And compared to the other 8x8 matrix I mentioned that I have, that's a lot better, because the other matrix I've got, when you put it into standby, it continues to draw 50 odd watts and the fans continue to run, so it doesn't really turn off. And then with that matrix, you've basically got to kill the mains power and restart it over the mains using some sort of smart plug. And then with that, you've got to wait for the management controller to boost up. So with this, it is quite good that in standby, the power consumption drops down reasonably low, so it still sits in a state that you could wake it up over the network if you wanted to. But yeah, with that kind of power consumption, you probably don't want to run this 24/7, you do probably want to put it in standby when you're not using it. And with my setup here, I'll try and figure out some smart way of doing that, whether I use the video source detection on this to work out if it's not seen a source in a little while and then it'll turn itself off. I'll maybe work something out and build something to allow me to automatically power this down. But yeah, that's power consumption there for people that care about it. And now, let's go and get this installed in the rack. And by the time we come back, this should all be up and running. Okay, so now I've got the matrix installed in the rack. So now let's take a look at the setup. So yep, the matrix is installed there. As you can see, I've kind of spaced it down from all the other equipment in the rack, just because I kind of want to grow the networking and sort of server equipment downwards, then have the matrix, and then have the rest of the space below that for things like the audio equipment, just to kind of separate the rack into two sections, so that's why it's kind of low down there. But yep, that's matrix installed in the front of the rack. Okay, and now here we are in the back. As you can see, we've got the matrix installed there, and we've got all the connections in. So top right, we've got power and a network connection, and then in the bottom row, we've got 4 Cat6 cables going out to various rooms for the HDBaseT receivers. There will also be a couple more to add. There are a couple of TVs that I haven't actually installed yet, so they're not in yet, but we've got 4 TVs currently connected up with those cables. And then in the middle for sources, you can see we currently have a pair of Chromecasts. Now, long term, I probably want to add more sources to this. I've got an Apple TV I might add. I might also bring the Skybox out here, depending on how I feel about that. But right now, I've installed a couple of Chromecasts, which will allow me to cast media sources to various rooms, and having 2 of them means I can kind of have 2 things on the go at any time. And this can be anything from video and media content for TVs, all the way through to just casting Spotify and feeding the audio into the Multiroom audio distribution to play audio in various rooms. So those Chromecasts are what I'm using for now. So we've got 2 Chromecasts in there. And then, just like out of interest, it's a bit of an aside from this, is as you can see, I've got both these Chromecasts hooked up to the network over Ethernet. Because obviously this is out in the garage, the Wi-Fi does reach out here, but it's not really great. And they're installed inside a big metal cabinet, so I'd rather hardwire them into the network. So this is something that many people might not know, is that with Chromecast, you can, at least this generation, you can actually hardwire them to the network. All you need is a USB-C Ethernet adapter that has a power input. So what we have here is a USB-C Ethernet adapter plugged into the Chromecast, the adapter is then plugged into the network, and then the Chromecast power supply is then plugged into the Ethernet adapter to pass power through. And that works absolutely brilliantly. So it means these Chromecasts aren't on Wi-Fi, they're actually hardwired into the network over Ethernet. There's a bunch of additional work I might want to do here. For example, I might want to get rid of these 2 USB power bricks and have 1 big power brick powering everything. I need to get some sort of audio stuff connected up here once I get the audio distribution in, and various other things like that. But right now, that's what we have. So yeah, that's Matrix connected up there in the garage. Okay, so now here we are inside the house. So here in the living room, we've got a receiver connected up to the back of the TV, and then also connected to one of the Cat6A ports on the wall. I might move this down to be connected into the receiver, I'm not sure yet, but it works absolutely fine connected to the back of the TV for now. Now through in the kitchen, we've also got a somewhat temporary setup. So we've got a TV on a stand here. This is a Samsung frame TV, so long term this is going to be installed on the wall, and then this one connect box houses all the connections will be hidden inside a cabinet through an adjacent room. But right now it's just sitting down here, so I've connected the HDBaseT receiver up to the one connect box, and once again it's connected to a Cat6A point on the wall down there. Then through the master bedroom, you're probably getting the idea by now, down the back of the TV, we once again have an HDBaseT receiver that's connected to the Cat6A point on the wall and into the TV. And then finally through in the guest bedroom, exact same idea, TV on the wall, and then once again down the back of the TV, maybe just about make it out down there. You can see we've got an HDBaseT receiver tucked down the back of the TV. Actually, can't see that. It's down there. It's a bit tucked in. This TV bracket is very flat to the wall, so it's all a bit jammed in down the back there. And then with this matrix, with this receiver here for this TV, because this is only a 1080p TV, not a 4K TV like all the others, the matrix output that is connected to this TV is set to downscale 4K to 1080p. So if I'm displaying a 4K source in one room, it can still be displayed on this TV. The matrix does the downscaling. So yeah, that's all the hardware installed. Okay. So finally, let's take a very quick look at the setup I've built actually working. Obviously, this is very much a prototype. There's still a lot of implementation I need to do, getting it all integrated and working out how to control it. But I've kind of got it working with Home Assistant, got a bit of an interface I can control all this with. So I'll show a quick demonstration of my Home Assistant setup. Now, this is something that's going to require a fair bit of work as time goes on, and I'm not going to have time to go into full detail showing how I've built all this. So once I've got more time, I'm going to do some dedicated videos on my Home Assistant setup. But I'll do a little quick demonstration towards the end of how I've got this set up. I won't go into a full setup tutorial. What we have here is I've got a section for areas. If I go into areas, I've got all the different rooms in the house. Of course, there's more rooms that I'll add in the future, but these are currently the ones that have something I want to control, either lights or, in the case of many of these, the HDMI Matrix. So I'm in bedroom 1, so I'm going to go to bedroom 1 here, then there's a media option, so I go to media, and this is where I can control everything. So the volume control is just a placeholder that's not doing anything right now. That'll feed into the audio system once that's installed. But I've got this section here called media source. So when I change this, I can pick the various sources that are connected to the Matrix. Currently I've only got Chromecast A and Chromecast B, the other two are just also placeholders. But what will happen is when I pick a source here, the Matrix will switch that source through to the output that's connected to this TV. It will also send a CEC source active command to this TV, which will cause the TV to automatically switch to the appropriate HDMI input to switch to the Matrix receiver. And then it will send a CEC power on command to the connected source device, in this case the Chromecast, to power the Chromecast up. So in theory, if I pick Chromecast A from this menu, the TV should automatically switch to the HDMI input and the Chromecast should show up. So let's pick that and see what happens. There we go, TV is now switched to the HDMI input, which is the HDBaseT receiver. The Matrix will switch the input and the Chromecast powered on. There we go. So that's now worked. So now we're seeing the Chromecast on the bedroom TV. Now the next question is, how do I control this kind of stuff? Now, for a Chromecast, to be honest, I can just cast sources to it, which is generally the plan for this. So if I say I want to play music in the bathroom, I can just switch the source around through Home Assistant, cast Spotify to the Chromecast, and it'll just handle all the switching automatically. I shouldn't need to do it through the on-screen display. But longer term, I'll probably build out some way of controlling this as well. Initially, I'll do it through some sort of Home Assistant interface with a kind of on-screen remote, and then longer term, I want to play about with different smart remote controls that could potentially control this. But one thing I wanted to demonstrate is that because this Matrix actually has CEC control, you can actually control a lot of connected devices by issuing CEC commands. So right now, I'm just doing this through the web interface with the Matrix itself, but you could very easily use the serial commands or the Telnet commands to issue these CEC commands from some other piece of software. So we can pick, say, Chromecast A, and then if we use the arrow keys here, you might see on the TV in the background, there we go, we're now actually controlling the TV. So we go right, switches along, that works. So what I'll do just for the sake of demo is I'll open up the YouTube app on Chromecast A, just so the Chromecast A interface looks different to Chromecast B, so when we switch source we can see that we are getting two different Chromecasts. So that's now YouTube on Chromecast A. So yep, that's the Chromecast A source. So now if we come into the Home Assistant interface on here, we can then pick Chromecast B from the list, like that. It'll now switch over, the Matrix will switch over, and then we'll pull up Chromecast B. So now we can see we've got two different Chromecasts, one on the YouTube app, and then one just sitting on the home screen. So next up, we're in a different room. So we're now through in bedroom 4, so we go into bedroom 4 in Home Assistant, and then go to media, and then in here we've got the exact same interface as the other room. Unlike before, the TV is not on the HDMI input, we're sitting on one of the Freeview inputs, or the Freeview source with the program guide up, just to demonstrate the automatic input switching. So like before, if I go to media source and pick Chromecast A to start off with, the TV will automatically switch to the HDMI input, and up comes Chromecast A. So this is the first Chromecast, as we can see it's on the YouTube app, so yeah, that's worked. So yep, that's Chromecast A there. Once again, if we go into the app, pick Chromecast B, it'll change again, and we'll pull up the other Chromecast that's just showing the home screen. Like that. And then what you can also see on this Chromecast here is, as you can see, the resolution we're outputting is 4K 60Hz. But as I mentioned, this is only a 1080p TV, and if you press the input info button on this, you'll see we are just feeding it a 60Hz 1080p signal, and that's because that scaler's working. So yeah, we can happily have a 4K source in one room and have it automatically downscaled by the Matrix for lower resolution TVs. It works brilliantly. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, this won't handle HDR tone mapping, so if you're playing, say, an HDR source in one room, this TV, which doesn't support HDR, would probably look a little bit washed out, but because I'm only using this for like casting fairly normal media, nothing particularly fancy, I've just left these on SDR, so it works fine in all the rooms. The final feature I've added to my Home Assistant interface is this solo button, and each room has its own solo button next to its source selection. And what this does is when you press it, for the particular source that you've picked in that room, it will turn that source off in any other room that is also showing that same media source. So for example, we're in bedroom 4 here, we have Chromecast B selected, and then if I go through to bedroom 1, media, we also have Chromecast B selected. So what would then happen is if I then press solo for bedroom 1, what this will do is it will turn off Chromecast B in any other room that's showing it, including this one here. So if I press solo here, that will turn off. If we then go back out to bedroom 4, which is this room, we can see Chromecast B, the media source has gone to off, and therefore Chromecast B is now only going to be showing in bedroom 1. Now, this is going to hopefully be quite a useful feature, especially with the audio distribution, because right now, if I kind of go into various rooms and pick a media source, it will stay on in all of those rooms. And if that media source is playing, for example, through ceiling speakers, what I wouldn't want is a situation where I'm playing music in the kitchen in an evening, then the next morning I go in the shower, decide to play music in there, but the media source ends up still selected in the kitchen and the music plays out of both rooms. So the idea with that solo button is if I only want to play music in a single room, I'll pick the media source and then just sort of instinctively press solo. And if I want to play the media through multiple rooms, I can go in and just pick the same source in multiple rooms. It'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts on all this way of controlling it, or if people have a better idea than this. Realistically, I'm just kind of experimenting and finding out what works best for my particular setup. So that's kind of what the solo button does there. But yeah, as you can see, that works. We can now go back into bedroom 4 again, go to media, pick media source, pick say Chromecast A this time, and that'll pull up the Chromecast that's showing the YouTube app. It works absolutely brilliantly. It's gone to the screensaver now, but yeah, works absolutely perfectly. Okay, so I'm now going to do an extremely quick run through of the Home Assistant setup in a couple of minutes just so that I can try and keep this video under an hour. So what I've done for all the drop downs and solo buttons is I've created a bunch of helper objects. So I've got a helper object for each room's media source and a helper object for each room's solo button. These are all defined through a YAML file just because it's much easier to do that rather than the web interface when you're creating a lot of them, so it's much easier to just create it through a YAML file. I've ended up creating a handlebars template for the file and then a JSON file to kind of render that, and then I manually render it into the YAML file that I actually use. And then it's all tied together in Node-RED. So when any of the input selections are changed in Home Assistant, it triggers this block here. I've then got a bit of JavaScript here that parses that output to get me an input and output port number based on the matrix. That's then passed through here, and then use these templates here to generate the command to switch the input on the matrix, and then the CEC commands on the matrix as well. They're generated by these templates, and then these are passed through a block that terminates the appropriate line endings, and then these are passed out over a Telnet interface to the matrix. Not going to go into any more detail than that in this video, just because this video is far too long, but at some point in the future I will do a dedicated video showing the Home Assistant setup in much more detail. So there you go. That was a look at the initial setup of my HDMI video distribution setup. And this matrix is working absolutely brilliantly. It seems really stable, really reliable. It's pretty responsive when it comes to switching interfaces and everything like that. The built-in scaler is ideal for having all the mixed resolution TVs. And that CEC control works so nicely for being able to automatically switch TVs to the correct input, which is great because not all my TVs support control over the network, or it doesn't really work that well. So being able to just tell a TV to switch the right HDMI input using CEC through the matrix works really, really nicely. Now, of course, there's a ton of additional setup I need to finish off. I need to try and get the interface tidied up a little bit. I need to figure out some way to detect video sources and automatically power the matrix down when it's not in use, all that kind of stuff. But I'll be doing that after this video, and I'll probably come back with various updates and show off what I'm doing, and especially when I start adding all the audio distribution in, there'll be a lot more content around this when I start doing all that. So there you go. Hopefully you found this interesting. If you're interested in buying this matrix, I'll put a link in a pinned comment and in the description. And also stand by for an absolute ton of future content where I build out this AV distribution setup even further, where we add in the audio distribution, the audio matrix, figure out all different ways of controlling it, look at different universal remotes and all that kind of stuff. So there's an absolute ton of future content coming out on this. But for now, all I'd like to say is thank you very much for watching.